It's Mark Carriban. He's Asia Managing Director for Hudson. Hudson's one of the biggest names in the recruitment industry. Thank you very much for coming in, Mark. Let's just talk a little bit about what banks have been doing here. Is it true that essentially what they do is they overhire in the good times, which we haven't had many of those lately, and actually overfire when it comes to the bad times?
Well, a lot of people might say that. I think what we've found as the year has progressed is that the situation is becoming increasingly bleak, particularly in the financial services industry. If you look at half 2011, what we've seen is a world characterised by huge economic uncertainty and huge turbulence in financial markets. So if we went back to the end of Q2, start of Q3, most banks were still continuing to execute on the mandates that they gave us from a recruitment perspective. But the situation became increasingly bleak, and we're now at a situation coming into Q4 where the Hudson report, which is a quarterly report that we produce looking at forward hiring intentions, showed dramatic drops in hiring intentions and sentiment, particularly across Hong Kong and Singapore.
Really? I was going to say, I mean, how does that compare to, let's say, London and New York?
Well, perhaps not quite as bad as London, New York, because I think they've been in even tougher spots, yeah? And it compares very differently to some of the optimism on the mainland, for example, where there was just a minor correction in expectations. But what is very evident from the report we produced is that banking and financial services was the hardest hit. It showed the steepest fall year on year in terms of expectations to hire, and it showed the greatest appetite, if that's perhaps the right word, for looking at cutting jobs.
So just give me some of the figures here which would be involved for Hong Kong and Singapore.
Yeah. Well, Hong Kong, for example, going into Q3, we were looking from a banking and financial services sector perspective of some 62% of organisations saying we are going to increase our net headcount. Only 13 weeks later, those same respondents were saying it would be only 30%. If we looked at China and the mainland, which is still a relatively buoyant economy, thank heavens, there was a small adjustment, but some 2/3 of employers were still saying we're going to hire. But what we're seeing now in the market, as evidenced earlier on in your programme today as well, is that there are some very significant cuts happening now, which are in the public domain, which frankly were inevitable.
Yeah, okay. If I am working in financial services, what part of it, if I was in, let's say, fixed income or something, should I be more worried than somebody else who's working in corporate finance?
Well, it's very dangerous for me to generalise, and I do recognise it's a time of huge uncertainty for employees, and many of which, of course, are candidates of ours, and we spend time trying to counsel them as to what best to do.
I'm not asking you to name names, Mark.
Okay, well, that's good, because I can't. But I think I can say that there is that the cuts have been, particularly many of the foreign banks, largely across the board, but there's been some very well publicised units shut down in certain banks recently, perhaps around the M&A field. But it is not, I should stress, all doom and gloom. You know, there are still roles for good candidates. Most definitely the Chinese banks are taking it as a further opportunity to strengthen their bench. Yep. And a lot of the Asian banks continue to trade well. So there are pockets of opportunities, but probably the bleakest it's been this year. But I would also have to say it is not as bad, at least yet, as it was in Q4 2008, for example.
Right, but which is the worst affected sector of this?
Do you mean within banking?
Yes.
Well, we found a lot of the front office guys, particularly those who haven't been performing, perhaps in the eyes of the banks, have been let go. But then it is generally across the board, in front, mid, and back office. It's very dangerous for me to generalise.
Okay, so if I'm looking for a job,
yes, where
should I look?
Well, if you happen to be in risk and compliance, or you happen to be a very good internal auditor, or perhaps you happen to work in some revenue-generating front office roles, but very specifically, perhaps around commodities and resources, or perhaps around structured finance or trade, there are possibilities. Yeah? But my advice, by and large, is that if you have a job that you are happy with, then unless you can see an ideal opportunity, stay where you are.
Mark, thank you so much for that. Mark Carriban from Hudson Asia.